Welcome to another episode of the Indiana Hoosiers Roundtable podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Brown, joined only today by Jack Ankony. Unfortunately, Todd, a little bit under the weather, but also, Jack, we're kind of in the middle of like this long layoff. There's 9 days in between Indiana's games. We're a few days past that now at this point, but don't play Purdue for another five and had played UCLA 4 days ago. So kind of a weird long stretch until Indiana gets back on the basketball court. And man, it's so funny. We were talking a little bit before we started recording. We're like, we just keep getting everything wrong about this team. It's like, well, they'll lose when they go to Michigan State. We can talk about Bob Knight's record falling to Tom Izzo, and we'll look at the tournament. And of course, they go and win. And then we're like, okay, now they've got UCLA coming to town. UCLA hasn't won anything away from the West Coast yet this year, and they beat Indiana in Assembly Hall. It's like what? What's going on? Why do these things keep happening? Why can't we figure out what this team is going to do? How did they lose another close game? There's so many questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of just been the theme of the whole season. Like you talk to, different people that cover this team or Indiana fans, and it's sort of like no one really knows what to expect on a night-to-night basis, or even in some games it feels like a moment-to-moment or half-to-half basis. Sometimes they'll come out and put together, in UCLA they trailed by 10 at halftime. I think scored 25 points in the first half. Looked like nothing was working. And then they fight hard to get back in that one. So it's been a tough team to figure out for sure.
Well, they it was close. I mean, close doesn't really matter in basketball usually, but
Right.
they have had some ugly losses this year as well. So you take that a little bit, I guess, with the situation. I mean, the players know Mike Woodson's leaving. Mike Woodson knows he's running out of time here. Who knows if they're going to make the tournament? I mean, there's a lot of ifs kind of surrounding this program and some question marks up in the air and stuff like that. But they do lose a close one, 72-68 to UCLA. You can chalk it up as more late game issues. I mean, this has been another recurring theme for Mike Woodson in some of their losses. Obviously, in particular, the close ones. So what was it about this one? Why is this an ongoing theme that Indiana just can't close out these close games?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some of the other ones like Maryland or Purdue, you could point out some coaching mistakes and player execution. It's never one thing. But in this one, I really thought that Mike Woodson, I mean, he drew up a great play for Mackenzie Mbako off an inbounds pass to get a pretty much wide open three, and he just didn't make it. Um, Obviously you don't want to, you're not putting the whole game on one thing, but um, I mean the play before, I think there's been a few times, like you think back to the Purdue game, Miles Rice kind of tried to go coast to coast and take that shot. He sort of made a similar play in this one where it was an open jumper, but not maybe the most high percentage shot, kind of that in between like mid range shot. And then Mackenzie Mbako got the offensive rebound, and if you look at it on the replay, I mean, it sort of looked like he could have just gone up and dunked it and tied the game. But it goes out of bounds, and then Indiana gets the chance with Mbako on a three, pretty much wide open look that Woodson drew up, and it just doesn't go down. And so it has been a theme with kind of these late game execution mistakes, and it's sort of been a different thing in each one of them. And Mike Woodson, like, after the game, he's asked, why does your team keep falling short in these? And he's like, I wish I knew. And like, that type of answer is going to draw a lot of anger, I think, from fans and just like, well, you're the coach. This is what your job is. No, but like, I mean, what do you expect him to just throw his players under the bus? Or,
Sure.
after that, it's, one shot from from probably your second best 3-point shooter, get a good look for him, and it doesn't go down. But obviously, you can't only score 25 first half points and expect to win many games. So yeah, it's just tough, especially because you mentioned like the Michigan State game. They finally get a game. Woodson had been talking for so long about like, we just need to get a win to get some confidence under ourselves. And you thought maybe the Michigan State one, that was their biggest win in probably the last 2 seasons. And they just couldn't turn it into momentum for the rest of for a longer stretch.
It is interesting, when coaches are asked something like that and they give an answer about like, I wish I knew. Well, you're getting paid millions, you probably should know, but like Mike Woodson can't go out there and put the ball in the basket for
Right.
Mackenzie and Baco. Like what else can he really do? That's the nature of coaching and basketball and sport in general. And again, it's unfortunate that kind of a repeated pattern of these things is the reason Mike Woodson's not coming back now. And that's always there. You have to think that that's always there. Like every question he's answering is like, I'm about done. I wish I don't have any more answers to really give you at this
Yeah.
point. Like that's a tough
Well,
spot.
he's even stopped doing he stopped doing the pregame radio show,
Mhm.
and the last few games. I mean, against Michigan State, some of the players spoke, but they've really sort of limited how much Woodson is talking to the media after, which you can kind of tell. I don't think they've. I'm not trying to suggest that they've checked out in terms of their effort and things like that, but
Mhm.
you can sort of tell by him kind of skipping out on some of these things that obviously, the end is near for him, and he's sort of just trying to get some wins before it's over.
Yeah.
And I think the UCLA game you can kind of point to more player execution, but that's not to say, obviously this team is underwhelmed, and a lot of that falls back on Woodson as the coach. But that was one where it just sort of felt like Woodson was like, what can I do? We, in position to do it, and just got to make one or two more shots.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the players are they're playing. I mean, it doesn't look like they're not giving effort. It doesn't feel like that kind of a vibe, but it is a difficult situation knowing your coach is done, knowing you for whatever reason you're not stringing multiple wins together, your tournament chances are dwindling. I mean, this is a rough little stretch here that we thought was going to get rougher, and then again they beat Michigan State, so you're like, oh, maybe, and now it's been a little bit weird. It has been a little bit weird. A couple guys that you wanted to talk about, Miles Rice and Kanan Carlisle, were brought in to kind of help maybe stabilize some of that. I mean, guard play is so big in late seasons, late game situations. It's big in tournament play, and both Rice and Carlisle have been a little bit inconsistent. I mean, Miles Rice, I think it was you who brought up the point where he was like 9 games above 16 points and 9 games
Yeah,
below 6 or something like that, which is a crazy stat. And then
yeah.
Kanan Carlisle has kind of been a little bit underwhelming overall the whole season. So I mean, how do you kind of rate the way that these guys have played throughout, 20 plus games, and why hasn't it quite worked out like maybe the staff thought that it would?
Yeah, I mean, Mike Woodson said before the season, he's like, I've learned in my time coaching college that you got to win with good guard play. So that's why I
Mm.
brought in these guys, Rice and Carlisle. Because last year, Indiana had Xavier Johnson coming back for his senior year, and then he was hurt for a lot of the year and just was never really himself. And so they had to rely on some younger guys, had to move some positions around. So going into this year, it was like, all right, you got this guy, Miles Rice. As a freshman, he averaged 14 points, and was a Pac-12 Freshman of the Year last year. And he's had some good moments, like you mentioned. I think 9 games of 16 or more points, but he's had some moments, like I mentioned, in the UCLA game and in the Purdue game, where it almost seems like he's trying to force something, or go get the game-winning shot when it's not necessarily there. And I think that was kind of two issues in those losses. He's not the best defender. I think he gets to kind of beat off the dribble a fair amount. But it really just feels like it's never fully clicked with him. Like he's had some good games, but um, then with Carlisle, it's he's never really gotten off the ground. He
Mm-mm.
he was sort of similar to Rice in that he was a freshman last year at Stanford, averaged 11 points. Um, but since he's coming here, he's only averaged 4.5 points and shooting 29% from the field.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a confidence thing with him. Like you can tell kind of in some of the early games when shots weren't going down. Um, I think a big difference for him is at Stanford, he had a lot of freedom to sort of do what he wanted and sort of run the offense. And then he comes to Indiana, which is a more talented team, a more variety of scorers, and he sort of hasn't found his fit. And I think some of that falls back on Woodson in terms of not finding the best ways for these guys to help this team, because I think they're definitely talented, but it also probably goes back to maybe we had a little bit too high of expectations for these guys. And there was no, I mean, there was reason to feel good about him. But then when you also look at some of their shooting stats, like Rice only shot 27% as a freshman at Washington State. He's been a little bit better this year at 31. Carlisle didn't shoot very well, only 32% from three last year, and he's only 23% this year. So there were flaws in these players' games that I think we recognized, but maybe tried to be a little bit
Mhm.
more optimistic about going into the year. And it just really hasn't worked out. And they were two big reasons, not the only reasons it's been a disappointing season, but they were sort of, I think a lot of people expected them to be a big difference in this year's team compared to last year, and it just hasn't worked out.
And it may be way too early for this, and there's going to be a lot of things that happen, and changes can be major when you go through a coaching change. What do you think about the future for these two young guards now that we know Mike Woodson's leaving? They haven't been awesome, and particularly Carlisle. Are they Hoosiers moving forward? I mean, is that even something that's been talked about yet?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell because you don't know. We obviously don't know who the next coach is, so we don't know if it's going to be a situation where the new coach is able to bring in a bunch of his players from his other school,
Mm,
or maybe Rice and Carlisle say, "Hey, this year didn't really go how we wanted, and maybe we want to change the scenery too." So it's hard to tell. I think a lot of coaches would like to have a player like Miles Rice on his team. Um, he's really hard to stop with the ball in his hands when he's in the open court, just with his speed and quickness and things like that. And I don't think he's a bad 3-point shooter. I mean, he's had some games that just hasn't been very high volume. Um, I think there's a lot to like with Rice, and it's possible that whoever's the next coach would want to try to keep him if he wants to even stay.
sure.
Carlisle is a trickier case. I mean, it's just been jarring to see kind of the difference between last year and this year with him. And he was a guy that going into the year, some people thought had NBA potential. He was on some
Mhm.
mock drafts going into the year, and it just really hasn't panned out. So I think Rice is a guy that a coach would want to keep, but it's just really hard to tell right now, just in terms of who that's going to be, whether these guys fit into their system, and um, if they want to come back, and if the new coach has guys that he's bringing in. So it's hard to say now, but I think it's possible. They still have 2 years of eligibility left, so it's not like their career is over by any
Yeah.
means.
That's what makes it enticing, I think, because they are young still, and they
Yeah,
have they have eligibility left. They've already both played a lot of basketball, both Power Five. I mean, there's a lot to like about both. I just think it's interesting, and it's just crazy though in basketball when a coach leaves. Like, I mean, we're going to talk about Dusty May very briefly here in a second, Mick Cronin as well. But when a new coach comes in, you literally flip the entire roster in one season. In some
yeah,
cases, it just kind of depends on what's already there, and like you said, the system and some other things like that. So, with that being said, two of the three last games opposing coaches, Dusty May about a little over a week ago, and then Mick Cronin a few days ago, are on Indiana's hot board, I would think, in some way, shape, or form. Michigan is working diligently to try to get Dusty May a new deal and get him paid because he's done a great job in Ann Arbor. But what about Mick Cronin? He's out. He's not a West Coast guy per se, but he's done. UCLA's been inconsistent this year as well, so there's some talk that maybe it's not the best fit out there for him, but he's on the board as well. I mean, what are the thoughts about UCLA's Mick Cronin being IU's next coach?
yeah. I think it would be a good hire for Indiana, and I think there's reason to believe that he might want to leave. He's had some comments throughout the year about the disadvantages that UCLA is at from a travel perspective.
Yeah.
I think going into the Indiana game, they hadn't won east of the Rocky Mountains, and that's a very real thing that a lot of these Pac-12 schools that have joined the Big Ten are now dealing with. Um, it's tough to do those cross-country flights all the time. And, he also had some other comments early in the season just about his team being soft and how he's the only one coming to practice with all the energy. And so, I mean, there's some comments from earlier in the season that say, hey, maybe he's open to something else. And he certainly didn't say no, when people asked him about it at Indiana. He basically said, it'd be inappropriate for me to comment on a job because I still see it as this is Mike Woodson's team. So you respect him for that. But then he was also like pretty candid, being like, well, some people at UCLA might want me fired if we lose our next game. So, you got to sort of check your ego as a coach. But he was also sort of asked about just the stature of the Indiana job nationally. And, although Indiana hasn't had a ton of success really in the last 20 years or so, I think one of his quotes was, it's still the Hoosiers. There's certain blue blood programs and he's familiar with it with UCLA. He's like, certain programs that will just always sort of have that shine, even if the recent winning isn't there. So just sort of the way he talked, I mean, he didn't really directly address it, but I think his comments were, probably make you feel good if you're an Indiana fan wanting Cronin as the next coach. And I think he'd be a good hire. He's won consistently really for the last 15 years at UCLA and Cincinnati. If you go back, made a Final Four run, 2 Sweet 16s. They kind of fell off last year a little bit because they lost a lot of those guys from those tournament teams. But I think he'd bring a lot of toughness to the program. He's established at the high major level. And, it's hard to say if he'd be Indiana's first choice, but I think if maybe, they've already missed on, you had to make the call to Brad Stevens, and I didn't really ever think that was too realistic. But, as they sort of go through their list, I think Cronin would be a solid hire for Indiana.
He's 53 years old. He's an Ohio kid, and he spent from 1991 until 2019, he was either in Ohio or Kentucky. Like, he's not a West Coast guy. I mean, and
right.
For some dudes, that's a bigger deal than others. It kind of feels like a big deal for him. It just does. He's got like this, this tough nose, like little bulldog mentality. He doesn't look like UCLA to me. I remember when they hired him, I was like, I mean, he's a good coach. He's probably going to do well wherever he goes. But it does feel like an Indiana or like a Cincinnati, Ohio. Like, he's that kind of guy. It just seems like that might be a better fit. I don't know, but you never know.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. And I think when a lot of we've written sort of about Cronin as a candidate, and a lot of the comments on our page are fans, saying that they wouldn't want him. And a lot of it, I think, is because, they're talking about his personality, because he can be, you watch him on the sidelines and he gets fired up. He's not afraid to get in his players' faces and, scream at the refs. And he can be a little bit abrasive.
If only Indiana had like a history of coaches like that.
That's what I was going to say.
Maybe they would accept it. Like, why wouldn't they want that? That's
right.
Funny.
That's the ironic thing when I've been thinking about this. It's like everyone's like, oh, he complains too much, or he's too fiery. It's like, look at the guy that won these banners at Assembly Hall. And if he wanted Indiana, I think people would get over that too. That's ultimately what it comes down to. Like, sure, you can talk about, I think personality is a factor in terms of, like, I think that's part of the reason that Archie Miller didn't really work out at Indiana. I don't think he fully ever really embraced kind of being the face of a big program. I think Cronin is different in that respect, where he knows that it's obviously a big job and everything. And so, yeah, I mean, we got a long way to go with this. It could go at least another month, but I think Cronin would be a good hire. And I think Indiana just needs consistency and someone that's going to, put him near the top of the Big Ten and make the tournament every year. And that's basically what Cronin's done throughout his career.
So with the search ongoing, even though the season's still ongoing, that's also kind of a weird timeline. I mean, like, the search needs to be happening right now, but there's still games being played. Indiana has dwindling tournament hopes. So, it's a kind of a bizarre scenario, but we talked about Brad Stevens being out. He kind of publicly already said, like, I'm not really going to do that. We just talked about Mick Cronin. We mentioned Dusty May briefly as an IU guy as well, but he's doing big things at Michigan and they really want to keep him. Chris Beard has been mentioned a little bit here and there, and he's talked about Bob Knight publicly. And there's probably several other names. So just in a bubble right now, what's the coach search look like, even though the season's not even over yet?
Yeah. So it seemed like Stevens was the guy that a lot of the fan base really wanted. And there was some reports last week from Jeff Goodman that he's not going to be a candidate, which is not really a surprise. He's got one of the best jobs you could ask for with the Celtics. I think Beard is a name that you just look on social media and a lot of Indiana fans want. He's obviously done a good job at Ole Miss, which is not historically a good, successful basketball program. He took Texas Tech to the national championship, had some decent seasons at Texas before being fired. And I think the thing with him that might make it tough for Indiana is he does have some of those domestic violence issues in the past that the charges ended up being dismissed. But, that's something that might cause Indiana to look to someone else, even though he does have a good track record as a coach. I think Dusty, that's going to be a tough decision for him, because he has Michigan at the top of the Big Ten right now. But, I think Greg McDermott from Creighton is another name to maybe look at. I think, he's sort of similar to Cronin, a little bit older, but sort of similar in that he's been pretty consistent for a long time now. And, there's a bunch of other names that we'll write about too. We just wrote about Grant McCaslin at Texas Tech. He's won pretty much immediately at that program. So it's going to be a long way, and there's a ton of names out there right now. But that's sort of how I'd sum it up right now.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting, as the season winds down and other guys will become available. Guys that can't talk right now will start talking. I mean, yeah, it's gonna speed up in a hurry once these games finish up and once Indiana's season is over. So before that, though, they still have a handful of games. What is it? 1, 2, 3, 6 regular season games remaining. Potential Big Ten tournament, obviously, and then who knows with the NCAA tournament or whatever might happen for postseason play. They're still somehow hanging on. They're being mentioned. I think you said, what was it?
Lenardi had him first 4 out after the weekend. So that includes the loss and everything else that happened that weekend.
They're still there. I mean, unbiased national talking heads are still saying they got a chance, and they have 6 games remaining against some decent teams. Starting with, is it 5?
Yeah, 5.
5 games. Okay, I'm counting.
And then the Big Ten tournament, though. So yeah, so at least as long as they make the Big Ten tournament, which I think is pretty much almost a sure thing at this point.
5 games. Yes, I need to update my calendar with the X's crossing the days off. So they play Purdue in what, 5 days on Sunday.
Yep.
That's the next one coming up. It's at Purdue. Purdue is
in Bloomington.
Dude, I need to learn how to read, and I need to update my calendar. I need to do a lot of things. It's in Bloomington, which obviously usually is supposed to be a good thing, but that's been a weird, I think you guys mentioned that last time we talked, sometimes they've been better on the road, which is kind of an interesting angle. But so what does this game look like against Purdue? And then I guess with just 4 games remaining after that, these tournament chances that somehow are still hanging on.
Yeah, well, it sort of used to be like you felt like Indiana had a chance against almost anyone at home when you think of Mike Woodson's first couple seasons and even parts of last year. But this team's lost 4 home games in a row. So sort of the allure of the home court advantage has gone away a little bit, I think. But yeah, I mean, I think you feel good about the Purdue game when you look at how Indiana played at Mackey Arena. I think that was a game that a lot of people didn't give Indiana much of a shot at. I think they were 12-point underdogs, and they took Purdue to the wire at a place that's really difficult to play. So I think it's a game that you expect Indiana to come out and play hard just because the in-state rivalry aspect. And, this team's got a lot of seniors who it's their last game against Purdue. It's Mike Woodson's likely last game against Purdue, obviously, unless they meet in the Big Ten tournament. I think with this game, you feel good about maybe Mackenzie Mbako having a big one. I think he had 24 points or something like that against Purdue in the first matchup. I think he's a tough matchup for Purdue because they don't really have he had 25 points. They don't really have he's basically a 6'8" wing, that can shoot over a lot of guys, can beat you off the dribble. I don't think Purdue has a great matchup for him. When you look at their roster, they don't really have that type of, a lot of their guards are sort of on the smaller end, and they don't have a whole lot of big wings. So I think he's sort of a matchup issue for them. Then when you look at the first matchup, Trey Galloway and Umar Ballo played really well, I thought, in sort of that pick and roll 2-man game at Purdue. So, Matt Painter even said after the game, he's like, we're lucky that Galloway didn't have it in his hands at the end of the game, which is sort of another one of those games with the late game execution mistakes. So I expect Indiana to come out and play hard and compete with Purdue. Purdue is on a slide of its own. They've lost 2 games in a row to Michigan and Wisconsin, who are obviously 2 really good teams towards the top of the Big Ten. And they have to go to Michigan State tonight on Tuesday before Indiana. So I expect Indiana to play hard in that one and compete. In terms of the NCAA tournament, we're still saying Indiana's, hanging on as the first 4 out, but they got to get a win at some point to really solidify that. The Penn State win from January has now dropped down to quad 2 because Penn State keeps losing. So that doesn't help Indiana. But, if you look at the schedule, Purdue, Penn State, then at Washington, at Oregon, and home against Ohio State, that looks a lot more friendly than the gauntlet that they just went through with all those ranked teams. So especially if you beat Purdue, but even if you lose to Purdue and then say maybe you finish 4-1 or 3-2, I think that puts Indiana in a pretty solid position going into the Big Ten tournament, or maybe if you pick up a win there, you can sneak in maybe into that first 4 round or as a 10 seed or something like that. So it's possible. Indiana has not gotten blown out, as that sounds like loser talk, but they've played a handful of close games in their last 3 against Michigan, Michigan State, and UCLA. So long way of saying they still got a shot, and they've been right there in their last few games. So we'll see.
It does kind of feel like 3-2 is. We've been wrong. We've been wrong a lot, but I will say that does feel like the most realistic outcome, in my opinion. 4-1 possible.
Yeah.
And who knows? Who knows? I mean, teams get hot sometimes right about now. You never know, man. You never know. Purdue's tough. And then 2 West Coast. I mean, I think Indiana can beat Washington and Oregon, but going out west is tricky. And so, you'll see, and then you get the rest at home.
Yeah, it's like if you split the West Coast trip, and then you get 2 of the 3 home games.
2 beatable teams, at home.
Yeah. They're right there, but obviously their chances are running out because that's what we've said all year. Oh, they still have the opportunities, and they've let a lot of the opportunities slip away, but so that there's not a whole lot of margin for error now, but still got a shot.
Still got a shot. 5 games left, some winnable ones, a tough one coming up on Sunday against Purdue. And we will be back to talk about that on Tuesday. So that's sandwiched in between the Purdue game and the Penn State game. So we'll get a chance to talk about the results from Purdue and preview the Nittany Lions a little bit. He is Jack Ankony, boots on the ground, expert on Indiana basketball. And hopefully we'll get Todd back, as he's been a little bit under the weather. So thanks everybody out there for listening, and we will be back next week.